In December 2012, the plasma physicist David LaPointe published a series of videos about a phenomenon that he called the primer fields. With his discovery, he takes aim at long-held mistaken theories about the physical universe, including black holes, dark matter, and dark energy, which are not required to interpret the observed evidence of the universe. In his videos, David LaPointe illustrates the existence and the operating principles of the most basic electromagnetic fields that shape the solar system, the galactic system, and ultimately the cosmic environment. He suggests that these basic primal fields, which he discusses, are fundamental to the order and operation of the universe, and are even reflected in the transmission of light and the structure of matter itself, all the way down to its smallest subatomic forms. On the gigantic scale, the electromagnetic fields that he recognized to exist and has explored in the laboratory shape entire galaxies. They are so fundamental to almost everything that he calls them the primer fields. In fact, without the primer fields and their effects, our sun and planets, even the galaxy itself, might not have been created, so that nothing would actually exist without them. Star formation in a galaxy typically occurs in intensely focused and compressed plasma that the primer fields facilitate, to the point that nuclear fusion occurs, by which atoms, stars, planets, and entire galaxies are formed. The term primer fields is also justified because on the smaller stage of our solar system, the operation of the primer fields, though they are correspondingly smaller in size than on the galactic scale seen here, is critical for the dynamic operation of our solar system as a single functional unit. David LaPointe also discovered that the principles of the fields that he calls the primer fields is such that the galactic plasma streams that flow through the solar system become concentrated to a high degree of density around the sun, which he replicated in principle in laboratory experiments. The result of his work brings a radically new dimension to the perception of the sun, and also of the dynamics of the ice ages. The perception of the sun as an electrically powered star has existed for a long time already. A large body of evidence exists to support the electric sun theory. But it had a weak point. For the theory to work, a high concentration of electric plasma was required to exist around the sun, which put the theory in doubt. As an alternative, the theory of the nuclear fusion-powered sun was created, except the observed evidence doesn't support this theory either. The sunspots on the surface of the sun show the sun to be darker below the surface. We should see the opposite if the sun was internally powered, instead of being electrically powered at the surface. Also, the fusion sun theory cannot readily explain the 11-year solar activity cycles in which the brightness of the sun varies by a factor of 20 when observed in the high ultraviolet band. The fusion sun theory has it that the photon travel time from the sun's deemed fusion center to the surface is deemed to be in the range between 10,000 and 170,000 years, while the assumed energy transfer time itself from the center of the sun to the surface is deemed to be on the order of 30 million years. This hardly supports the 11-year solar cycles in which the sun's magnetic field changes direction at every cycle. The contribution that David LaPointe brings to the table in this debate weighs enormously in support of the electric sun theory by illustrating how the high-density plasma field is created around the sun that the theory depends on. The primer fields theory takes away the barrier against the electric sun theory, which thereby becomes totally plausible, together with a number of related theories that thereby likewise become plausible. However, the primer fields theory takes us one critical step beyond merely supporting the electric sun theory. It renders the functioning of the electric sun subject to a minimal threshold of conditions that must be met for the sun to be powered, which, when it is not met, causes the sun to become inactive, dim, and cold. While David LaPointe may not have intended to support the electric sun theory, his work illustrates that the process that creates a dense plasmasphere around the sun happens because the primer fields have that effect. It is known in plasma physics that these fields themselves depend for their existence on a minimal density in the plasma that flows through the system. If the threshold is not reached, the fields do not form. If the fields do not form, or cannot be maintained, the sun does not have the condition established for it to be powered. It simply turns off to an inactive state in which it glows dimly by its stored-up energy, and some nuclear decay processes within it. The required threshold, therefore, becomes an important factor in considering the dynamics of the ice ages. Just imagine the consequences on the Earth when our brilliant sun is suddenly turned off, as the primer fields collapse, and loses more than 2/3 of its energy output in possibly a single day. The conventional theories of the Ice Age dynamics all regard the Ice Age glaciation as the result of a gradual cooling of the Earth. One theory sees the cooling being caused by cyclical variations of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, with the Sun remaining an invariable constant by this theory. In the fusion sun theory, the Sun is deemed to be an invariable constant, so that the ice ages are caused by anything else except the Sun. The resulting orbital variation theory, known as the Milankovitch theory, however, has so many holes in its fabric that it is generally no longer seriously considered as a cause for the ice ages. The standard electric sun theory doesn't have this problem. Plenty of evidence exists that the power output of the sun does vary with the density of the electric input. The large temperature fluctuations that are known to have occurred over the last 500 million years are evidently the result of cyclical electric input fluctuations. The primer fields theory does not change that, but it does open the gate to the recognition that the entire process of the powered sun can collapse when a minimal power input threshold is not met, as we have seen happening during the ice ages. The primer fields theory brings a huge difference to the table. In the past, it was believed that ice age conditions develop slowly and gradually over extended periods so that humanity can adjust itself to the changing conditions, even in cases when the Earth becomes 5 times colder than the Little Ice Age had been over the span of 50 years. The primer fields theory jolts us out of this dream, or at least it should. If the fields are not maintained sufficiently that they collapse and vanish, extremely radical changes occur in as short a time as possibly a single day. The primer fields theory takes away the general notion that we have a long time to prepare for the coming ice age, and don't need to respond yet. It tells us that the opposite is true, that we need to get prepared as fast as possible, which almost no one is yet willing to even consider. In this context, the primer fields theory presents us a great blessing in disguise. It forces us, if we are willing to respond, to redevelop our humanity as fast as possible, which we urgently need in the present to avoid the catastrophe of nuclear war that no one will likely survive, for which the preparations are ever more intensely pursued in numerous ways. In this regard, the potentially near, rapid ice age transition that the primer fields theory brings into view offers us an incentive to get our act together, which would be the greatest salvation that we could experience on every front where civilization is presently fast collapsing. The primer fields theory illustrates a single basic principle that applies to all complex systems, including civilization. In economics, when the creative and productive power of a nation diminishes below a minimal threshold, the entire economic system disintegrates. It becomes inactive. The nations collapse. The world becomes cold. The people die. This happens to cultures too when the recognized value of our humanity drops below a minimal threshold. Nuclear war happens then, when the humanist culture disintegrates. We are close to the minimal threshold on a number of these vital fronts, especially in economics. For example, when the assumed value of money drops below the point where the value of money becomes uncertain in the markets, it becomes meaningless at this point. At this point, the financial markets collapse, banks close, stores close, gas stations close, transportation collapses, the food supply system stops, the entire platform of physical infrastructures becomes inactive. The world's money value system can unravel in a single day. No one knows how close we are to this day. The Glass-Steagall law that once protected the value of money in the USA has been repealed in Congress in 1999 by a bunch of traders who were bribed to do so with a $350 million slush fund. To date, all efforts have failed to restore even this minimal protection of the value of currency that the repealed law had afforded for the 66 years in which it was active. Against the background of the now fast collapsing value of money, the entire economic system can collapse in a single day, just as the presently powered sun can go inactive in a day when the fields collapse that prime its operational environment. David LaPointe's work illustrates that the electric sun, which varies only slightly during the interglacial warm period that we are presently enjoying, will with great certainty go completely inactive when the plasma density of the electric streams feeding into the solar system falls below the threshold level where the primer fields collapse. In astrophysics, that's the point where the Ice Age transition begins. That's what happened 120,000 years ago. The current trend suggests that we will cross the cutoff threshold in the near future. An ice age begins when the minimal conditions no longer exist for the system to function that powers the sun. The sun reverts to its default state, then its inactive state. It turns dim in a single short step, and the climate on Earth, that loses 2/3 of its energy input, turns cold. At this point, rapid deep cooling begins all across the Earth. Before this point is upon us, all the preparations for the dramatic changes in the Earth's environment will have to be completed. To fail is not an option if we want to continue to live. For this reason, it is not an option either that we raise the value of our humanity far above the present level and protect it on all fronts. And this needs to begin now. The analysis of ice cores drilled from the ice sheets of Greenland indicates that the sun became inactive 120,000 years ago. That's when the last ice age started. The ice core records also tell us that the sun became activated for short periods every 1470 years throughout the entire glaciation period. The periodic rewarming may have prevented the Earth from freezing up completely. The inactive periods of the sun were nevertheless long enough to create the huge cooling on Earth that lays up ice sheets across the northern hemisphere more than 10,000 feet deep, which are known to have existed. It is here that the theoretical becomes important for us all in a critical practical manner. The present trends suggest that the turn-off transition that makes the sun inactive might be upon us in 30 to 50 years' time. When this happens, the entire world will have to live with a dimmer sun on a colder Earth. Of course, this poses some challenges for maintaining our food supply. The chlorophyll in plants will have to function at reduced energy levels and with a shifted radiation spectrum. Here a great challenge arises for humanity as a whole to work together to create infrastructures that are needed to maintain our food supply in the coming dimmer and colder world. While it is technologically and economically possible to meet this challenge, the question remains whether we will do what is needed to maintain our existence. The wide range of considerations that come into focus in the context of the dimming sun evidently determines the topics that this video is focusing on. The video focuses on the theories and the evidences and how they will impact us all when the changing conditions unfold as expected. And at the end, the video will also focus on the dimension of our response to the expected conditions. This remains presently the biggest open question of them all. The shape of the galaxy shown here illustrates to some degree, in principle, the shape of the plasma environment in our solar system, though the density in the solar system is presently too low for the organizing plasma streams to be seen. However, by replicating the shaping process in the very small, in the laboratory environment, we can explore the forces that shape these types of phenomena. David LaPointe discovered in laboratory experiments that the primer fields, when they exist and are functioning, physically prime the environment of the solar system with a densely compressed sphere of plasma centered on our sun. The principle is illustrated here. The effects, however, that David LaPointe discovered are so amazingly critical that great problems arise for humanity when their functioning is impeded or is collapsing. The evidence tells us that the dense plasma environment that is focused on the center of the solar system enables our sun to be electrically powered from the outside by electric arc reactions. In these reactions, the condensed plasma interacts with the sun's photosphere. The condensing process is a multi-stage process that is illustrated to some degree in the Red Square Nebula. The nebula is not the remnant of an exploding star as nebulas are often regarded. Instead, it is an example of the typical features of the primer fields in operation. The fields formed by the principles inherent in the flow of electric plasma in space. The details will be discussed later, though the overall effect is noteworthy here. The effect of the fields is that plasma streams that exist in galactic space in wide channels becomes drawn together like by a wide funnel and becomes magnetically focused from the funnel onto a central sun, or a system of multiple suns that become intensely powered by this process. The planets exist outside of this densely powered sphere, on an ecliptic centered on the sun, between the two primer field structures. The plasma concentration process that we see in operation here, which is basically the same for every sun, renders our sun as an intensely powered catalytic energy converter that is powered not from within, but is powered externally at its surface. The evidence that the sun is externally powered is fairly obvious. When we look beneath the high-powered photosphere, through the open space at the umbra of the sunspots, the sun reveals itself as being much darker and therefore cooler inside. The photosphere has been measured at a whopping 5,870 degrees Kelvin, and the surface, below at a mere 3,000 degrees. This means that the sun's great brilliance is electrically generated at its very surface, and does not emanate from within from nuclear fusion reactions, as it is generally believed. The plasma concentration process that enables a sun to be electrically powered has been replicated in lab experiments. There, a highly compressed plasma sphere was formed in a thinly filled chamber of gas between two bolt-type permanent magnets that replicate the functional elements of the primer fields. The result, which is shown here, was developed by the functions of the magnetic fields acting on the plasma flow to concentrate it. It is interesting to note that in the lab experiment the plasma sphere at the center did not form instantly. The operating environment needed to be established first. However, in the real world this establishing function also includes the forming of the bowl-shaped magnetic fields themselves by which the plasma becomes concentrated. In the lab, the magnetic fields were provided with manufactured magnets. In the real world, the bowl-shaped magnetic fields are electrically created structures that are formed by moving electricity and plasma streams. This means that the plasma sphere in which our sun is located is the composite result of complex processes working together, for which a certain level of plasma input density is required for the forming of the magnetic bowl structures to happen. I will illustrate later how the bowl-shaped magnetic structures are formed that furnish the primer fields, which in turn create the conditions that focus plasma onto our sun, that lights it up to great brilliance. It has become evident in lab experiments that when the input density of the plasma streams that feed into the system drops below a certain minimum threshold, the critical fields can no longer be maintained. They simply collapse, whereby the entire process stops. When this collapse happens in the real world, the brilliant photosphere of our sun is no longer being powered. It becomes in effect turned off. It fades into a thin haze, leaving in the wake a colder, darker, yellow sun that glows dimly by its internally stored up energy, like embers of a fire gone out, which too then slowly diminish. This means that the transition to the next ice age will not be a slow process that is drawn out over thousands of years, but will be a radical turn-off transition in which the sun grows dim in possibly a single day. There exists plenty of evidence in ice core samples that the kind of rapid transformation of the climate on Earth has happened that reflects an on-off transition from an active sun to a deactivated sun. Nothing short of such a radical transition can explain the massive, rapid cooling that occurred when the last ice age began 120,000 years ago. It takes a massive reduction in solar energy input into the Earth's climate to cause the formation of the enormous ice sheets that become spread across much of the northern hemisphere, as it is shown here, which piled up 10,000 feet thick, or more in some places. When the input plasma streams for the solar system diminish below the cutoff threshold, where the sun turns off, a radically different world unfolds. The actual time frame in which the collapse of the climate follows may be extremely short, probably spanning less than a single year for all practical purposes. We are presently near the cutoff point. We have come to the end phase of the actively powered period of the sun, and the beginning of the next 90,000-year glaciation period. Of course, we don't know the precise day or year at which the primer fields will collapse, and the plasmasphere around the sun will vanish, but do we really need to know this? We know already enough to be inspired to take the appropriate actions to build new infrastructures for our food supply and for our living. We know with measured evidence on hand that the Earth has been in a diminishing trend for 3,000 years already, that appears to be now accelerating towards the critical cutoff point. We know that over the time frame of a single decade, NASA's Ulysses spacecraft has measured the amazing weakening of the solar wind pressure by a whopping 30%. This is an enormous drop-off for such a short period. We also know that when the sun's powered state ends, that is when it gets turned off to a lower intensity state, the big ice sheets will form. It takes a big change in the incoming energy that warms our planet for big effects to happen. Let's hope that the cutoff point that we are moving towards is still more distant in time than it appears to be, because at the present time no one of humanity is prepared for the consequences. Not the least preparations are even considered to be made, much less are made, even while the consequences, when they begin, promise to be far bigger than most people dare yet to imagine. At the beginning of the last ice age, the temperature derived from ice core samples in North Greenland dropped off steeply to about the midpoint of the deep glaciation level. This made the Earth about 20 times colder than the Little Ice Age had been. However, the sharp drop-off doesn't show up in ice core samples drilled from the ice in Antarctica, nor do the rapid oscillations show up that span the entire glaciation period, which are clearly evident in the Greenland ice core samples. Does this mean that the rapid oscillations did not occur, or might be local occurrences? It is tempting to assume this, because without the primer fields theory, that makes it rather plain that the sun can rapidly alternate between on and off states. It is almost impossible to explain the large and fast climate oscillations that the Greenland ice core samples tell us of. But with the primer fields theory considered, the enigma resolves into simply a series of events in which the sun is actively powered for a brief span, followed by a longer span of the sun becoming inactive again. The Greenland ice is much more sensitive and able to preserve these fast fluctuations than the ice in Antarctica. Antarctica, being an ice desert, one of the driest spots on Earth, it would be naturally less responsive to short-term variations of the type that we would expect to see when the sun switches from its powered state to its non-powered state, where it shines only dimly with its internally stored-up energy. The type of rapid fluctuation that would be indicative of on-off transitions of the sun would evidently be more strongly apparent in the ice core samples drilled from the ice sheets in Greenland, which is far from being a desert. The temperature record that is shown here is from the North Greenland project, where the temperature range gleaned from the ice samples is several times larger than the equivalent in Antarctica. In both cases, the temperature gradient is gleaned from the ratio of the heavy oxygen isotope O18 in the air. This ratio is temperature sensitive. Colder temperatures produce a greater concentration of O18. The baseline concentrations also vary somewhat between the drilling sites, both in Antarctica and in Greenland, but show the same pattern. What we see in the Greenland patterns present strong evidence of the type that one would expect for solar on-off conditions, of which the Antarctic ice shows only the washed-out major trends. The rapid fluctuations that are detected in the Greenland ice are called the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations. These are transitions from deep glaciation conditions almost all the way back to interglacial conditions. These are enormous fluctuations. They tell us that the Earth heated up from full ice age conditions to near interglacial temperatures in 20 to 30 years and then cooled down again, gradually, to deep glaciation conditions in a few hundred years. This rapid warming and gradual cooling is evident in all of the big Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations. All told, 25 of these big fluctuations have been recognized. In some cases where the interval is long, where the gradual cooling spans a longer period, we see evidence of small, sharp, upward spikes along the way, suggesting that numerous short bursts of the powered state of the Sun have occurred that have caused a periodic re-warming of the Earth, and also of the Sun itself, internally. The evidence suggests that the last entire ice age, and those before, were created by a long series of the power-off state of the Sun interspersed with short periods of the Sun being fully powered. It appears that whenever the primer fields are established, the Sun is actively powered to roughly its full potential, and that both the Sun and the Earth cool down during the longer powered-off periods. It may seem irrational to assume that such a giant system as that which feeds our Sun can turn on or off in the space of the day. However, in electric systems, such rapid transitions are totally natural and are readily observed in the natural environment. When storm clouds reach high into the atmosphere, an electric field becomes established at times that extends into the stratosphere and causes a plasma flow connection. When this happens, the basic pattern of the primer fields appear in the sky. They flicker on strongly in the shape of giant red sprites, and then vanish just as fast. They rarely last for more than a second. The primer fields that activate our Sun evidently can flicker on and off in a similar rapid manner. What we see in the resulting relationship between the on and off periods for our Sun has an enormous impact on what will happen to the agriculture that we depend on the moment that the turn-off happens that marks the start of the next ice age. While we may see a gradual cooling of the climate of the Earth after the Sun turns off, the effect of the cooler Sun will have an immediate impact on agriculture. Not only will there be radically less energy available for the chlorophyll of the green plants to function, but the radiation spectrum will also shift away from the wavelengths of the visible light that are critical for the absorption by chlorophyll, without which plants cannot grow. When the Sun turns off, we will see an immediate 70% reduction of the total energy coming from the Sun, and an immediate shift of the energy profile towards the red. We can compensate for the energy loss by placing our agriculture into the tropics, enhanced with artificial lighting, and by placing some parts of it directly into indoor facilities with 100% artificial environments. While the Sun becoming inactive poses some challenges, the challenges are not insurmountable. As you can see, both types of chlorophyll get most of their energy from the shorter wavelengths, below 500 nanometers, which the Sun provides even less of when it dims down. However, since the absorption spectrum of chlorophyll is narrow and specific, only small amounts of energy are required when the lighting is tuned to the absorption bands. At the present time, only 2% of the solar energy received is actually utilized by the plants. The entire amount, then, can be provided with relative ease with the use of nuclear or more advanced types of electric power systems. This means that when the Sun enters its off state, that is its inactive residual heat state, the remaining sunlight will be essentially useless for most types of agriculture existing today. This means that all the new agricultural platforms that need to be built to maintain our food supply will have to be in place and be operating before the day the Sun becomes inactive. This is the new reality. The transformation of the Earth will happen almost instantly, possibly in the span of just a single day, or less. When the solar off transition happens, and it will happen, all of the temperate zone agriculture, where presently nearly all of the world's food is produced, will be instantly disabled. The transition won't happen gradually. It will happen instantly. It will happen without warning. And when it happens, the consequences will begin immediately, on the very day. That's what we have to be ready for. That's what we must prepare for. the larger climate transition that unfolds along the way, in which the snows no longer melt but increase. As big as this will all be, will actually be of lesser importance than the impending Ice Age transition. Thus forces us to begin the greatest world development ever imagined, and to do this on a gigantic scale, like placing 90% of the world's agriculture afloat on the equatorial seas, all connected by floating bridges, and it being serviced by a new society living in floating cities along the way. The requirements that we must meet for the future demand us to start a new age of automated industrial production in the present. This means now, and without fail, utilizing nuclear-powered high-temperature processes, with the use of basalt as the feedstock. Basalt is non-corrosive, and is lighter and stronger than steel, and is infinitely available. This also means that houses must be produced in automated industries, where they are produced at such a low cost and efforts that they can be given away for free, as a part of the new infrastructures for living that must be produced for the human journey to continue during the long nights of deep glaciation. If no preparations are made that compensate for the loss of the traditional food supply that results from the instant transformation of our planet when the sun turns off, then most of humanity will simply starve to death. This isn't something to aim for, is it? For this reason, the floating agriculture will be built with enhanced lighting, complete with floating cities to service them. These things will happen, because if we fail, the resulting effect will be worse than the effect of a nuclear war. The present global food reserves won't last for no longer than just a few months. It won't be a pleasant thing to watch 7 billion people to starve to death. Only a few million made it through the last glaciation cycle alive. We want to do far better this time around. And we will do better. The primer fields theory opens the door to understanding what we are up against and what we must prepare for. This gives us an advantage that did not exist in the earlier times, but which exists now for the first time in the entire history of life on our planet. Likewise, the technological power exists for this to happen, which makes it possible for the first time to build the infrastructures that we require to weather an ice age with. To get there, our entire civilization will likely have to be rebuilt and set afloat in the tropics, where land is scarce. This will happen. Shifting our agriculture into the tropics, where the sunlight is the strongest, will offset the early portion of the loss of the solar energy as the sun is powered off. Some form of minimal artificial lighting will likely have to be added, and artificial climate control will likely have to be added even in the tropics, together with increased CO2 concentrations for increased plant growth. These infrastructures will require some extensive scientific advances in plant biology and in physical engineering technology for the floating new environments, and the whole thing will have to be in place and the infrastructures be operational without fail before the transition happens. This means we should get started now. We still have a chance to get this critical work done. We better not waste this chance before us by doing nothing. It may be our last chance. The Ice Age transition will happen without fail. We can count on that. We are close to the transition to the next deep glaciation to begin, though we don't know how closes. We also know that the trend towards the next glaciation has been progressing for 3,000 years already, and is accelerating. We don't know exactly where the cutoff level is, beyond which the primer fields collapse, and the sun turns off. It may not be far below the level of the Little Ice Age. At the present trend, we may get to this point in 20 or 30 years, or 50 at the most. NASA's Ulysses spacecraft saw a 30% reduction in the solar wind pressure happening in just a single decade. That's not a small drop-off. And the trend is continuing. If our agriculture has not been transferred to the tropics before the high-power solar system stops, it's game over for humanity. Humanity will likely become extinct then, by the lack of food, except for a minuscule remnant of a few million that might escape their universal death. If death by starvation is what you wish for yourself and your children, then sit back and do nothing, because that way your desired fate will be assured with great certainty. The stepping away from this fate begins with the recognition that our sun would not be the brilliant life-giving fire in the sky without a dense plasmasphere surrounding it from which it draws its electric power that lights up its photosphere with electric plasma interaction. If this realization is made, half the battle is won, because everything follows, and the needed steps become logical. And this realization shouldn't be hard to make. It has been recognized a long time ago that our sun is not the steady-state nuclear fusion furnace, which it is widely said to be, but is powered by one of the vast networks of plasma streams that pervade the galaxies and the cosmos as a whole. Since plasma has mass, the plasma surrounding the sun becomes attracted by the sun's gravity and interacts with its outer atmosphere, the photosphere, which thereby becomes excited to 5,780 degrees Kelvin. It is that simple. The primer fields prime the environment in which the simple process unfolds for as long as the fields exist. Once you realize that this presently operating system will vanish in the near future, and that solutions are possible for humanity to move forward in spite of the dimmer sun, you may become inspired thereby to get out of the easy chair, to gain a fuller understanding of how the critical process operates on which your continued existence depends. The plasma physicist David Lapointe suggests that there is much more to the primer field's dynamics than what meets the eye. He suggests that our sun operates within a sphere of highly concentrated plasma that is generated by powerful magnetic fields, which he calls the primer fields, and that the plasmasphere around the sun is magnetically confined by these fields. If this was not so, our sun would be but a dim speck in the sky, without the large magnetic fields acting on it that surround it with a sphere of concentrated plasma. The Earth would be a cold planet then, extensively covered with ice, as it once was 700 million years ago. But is David Lapointe correct? Do they primer fields really exist outside the laboratory environment? Can they be seen? And if they do exist, and are visible, is it possible for these vital fields to collapse? So, let's explore what stands behind it all. The key component of the primer fields theory is the existence of one or two bowl-shaped electromagnetic fields. David Lapointe uses two bowl-shaped magnets of opposite magnetic polarity for his experiments conducted in a vacuum chamber. In the environment of space, however, no bowl-shaped magnets hang in the sky. For the required magnetic fields to exist, they must be generated by the natural phenomenon of electricity flowing as plasma in space. And this is exactly what happens. The term plasma refers to electrically charged particles that exist in free-flowing form in space, primarily as protons and electrons, the stuff that atoms become made of when they are bound together. In space they are free-flowing. However, flowing electricity creates magnetic fields, and by these fields the flowing electricity becomes pinched together. When electricity is carried by two parallel wires, with a current flowing in the same direction, the wires are attracted to each other by the Lorentz force. The same happens in plasma in space, where electricity is flowing freely without wires. Here the effect is called the Zeta pinch effect. In space, the flowing electric plasma particles are drawn to each other by the same magnetic forces that attract wires to each other. However, while the wires remain physically fixed, plasma currents in space become compressed into ever smaller magnetic confinement. By the confinement, the current density is increased, which in turn pinches the plasma current still tighter and tighter, forming a bowl-shaped magnetic field in the process at the very end of the pinched plasma stream. But something happens in the bowl when the plasma currents exceed a critical limit, as they converge to ever tighter confinement. The currents and the resulting magnetic fields become unstable by the pinch effect past a critical point. The currents become twisted into complex knots, whereby the bowl-shaped magnetic field that forms opens up at the center. There, below the opening, an electromagnetically confined, high-density plasma stream is formed by a number of interacting effects. On the platform of the primer fields, the entire structure that we see that extends across 50 kilometers from top to bottom, forms in a fraction of a second. Typically the sprite remains active for about a single second, until the plasma flow becomes too weak to maintain the primer fields. At the point when the primer fields collapse, the entire structure simply vanishes. In comparing the sprite with the larger scale of the solar system, the sprite's 1-second active time is comparable to the solar system's interglacial period of the Sun's active time of roughly 12,000 years. The on-off process is the same in both cases, though different in scale. Let me illustrate now how the process functions that forms the primer fields. This is best illustrated by looking at another lab experiment that is carried out with an instrument called a dense plasma focus device. The device is made up of a ring of electrodes that surround a hollow electrode at the center. When an electric field is applied, a plasma sheet forms. The plasma sheet is instantly drawn towards the opening of the central electrode, and is then drawn into it. By it being drawn into the opening, the plasma becomes extremely pinched together. There, it becomes unstable, and begins to twist. At first, the plasma twists itself into a spiral. Then a spiral becomes compacted. The more it becomes compacted, the more unstable the spiral becomes, and becomes twisted. Eventually, the twisting forms a complex knot. The illustrations are snapshots taken from a video about the dense plasma focus device. In space, the plasma instabilities that form the complex knots open the magnetic bowls that form at the end of the concentrated plasma currents. As the process unfolds further, a high-density plasma concentration forms outside of the magnetic holes. That's where the Sun is located in a solar system, and is powered thereby. When, however, the plasma streams are too weak to cause an extreme pinch effect to happen, the plasma streams simply flow through the solar system without activating anything. The Sun thereby remains dim and not actively powered. When the Sun is powered by a dense plasma sphere surrounding it, the flow-through process still happens. Plasma flows out of the plasma sphere, since the Sun utilizes only a small portion of it. In the outflow, another magnetic field is generated, but with the opposite polarity. The evidence suggests that all large electromagnetic structures that exist in space, when they are drawn to a sun, or on the larger scale to a galaxy, whereby the primer fields form, exist typically in complementary pairs. Between the two giant complementary electromagnetic bowls, a number of interesting effects come to light with interesting principles that are critical for the overall dynamic interactions. The magnetic fields are the strongest at the focal point of the bowl-shaped magnetic structures. In the narrow space between the two complementary structures lies typically a solar system with a sun, or several suns, on the central axis, and with the planets orbiting on a thin ecliptic plane, in the space between the two electromagnetic bowl-type fields. While the two bowl-type electromagnetic fields are each separate entities, they work together functionally, as a whole. Their function is to concentrate the plasma flows that pervade all space, and focus them into a tightly confined sphere, in which our Sun is located, and is powered by it. The remarkable concentration is accomplished in the laboratory by a set of two bowl-type structures, shown in red and blue, facing one another with opposite, complementary, polarities. The small point in the middle between the two magnetic bowl structures is where a polarity flip point is located. The flip point appears to be responsible for flipping the polarity of the Sun's magnetic field with every solar cycle. The location of the flip point moves slightly when one of the two bowl structures becomes weaker than the other. This effect causes the polarity of the magnetic field of the Sun to assume the dominant polarity, and thus flip with the 11-year solar cycles that are simply resonance cycles between the complementary magnetic structures. The plasma concentration that is required for the Sun to function is dynamically produced in the illustrated structure by the interaction of its three functional magnetic elements that are structured around the respective hole in the magnetic bowls. Each of the three structures has a specific function to fulfill. The flip ring flips the orientation of plasma. It flips it under the magnetic confinement dome, while the choke ring below helps to keep it there. The plasma particles that flow into the big red bowl are flipped upwards as they pass the flip ring, yellow. They are collected together there into a massive accumulation. The plasma particles become concentrated by this process. The concentration creates a high-pressure environment. The magnetic choke ring within the opening of the magnetic bowl focuses the escaping plasma flow into a tightly concentrated stream beneath the hole. In some lab experiments, the focus stream expands into a sphere. When plasma is drawn out of the sphere in the flow-through process, a complementary bowl structure is formed with opposite orientation and opposite magnetic polarity. In this structure, the outflowing stream of lesser density is drawn into the bowls, where it expands in the reverse process, reverting back to the normal density of the prevailing plasma stream. The process that is illustrated here can be verified with laboratory experiments. In a high-power plasma experiment of the type that is conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the complementary bowl structure that the plasma currents form by their own interaction is clearly visible. Also, the containment dome that forms inside the bowls is visible in the experiment that is illustrated here. In this particular experiment, the magnetically focused plasma stream that flows between the bowls did not form a sphere, for which a catalyst would be required, but it did form a distinct plasma ring around the focus stream, centered between the bowls. Evidence exists that the lab-created shape of plasma formed by the primer fields was visible in ancient time in the sky. Archetypal drawings collected from widely separated regions on Earth all show a remarkable similarity of their design with the lab-created plasma formations. The similarity suggests that the complementary plasma bowl shapes were common occurrences at one time, appearing and disappearing in the skies like so many UFO sightings today, or like the sprites still do under special conditions. David LaPointe also discovered two more features of the primer fields, for which widely known evidence exists, which are the plasma jets and the magnetic flip point. He discovered that when the plasma pressure under the confinement dome becomes too great, the dome will rupture at its weakest point, by which excess plasma escapes in a burst until the rift closes up again under the resulting lower pressure. By this plasma venting process, the magnetic strength of the respective bowl structure weakens somewhat. The resulting imbalance shifts the convergence of the magnetic fields, and with it shifts a magnetic flip point that David LaPointe also discovered forms below the opening of the magnetic bowl. In the case of the solar system, the resulting imbalance, which shifts the flip point, flips the sun's magnetic field at the high point of the 11-year solar cycles, are thereby recognized to be simply resonance cycles that oscillate between the two complementary electromagnetic structures of the solar system. What the complete primer field system that powers our solar system and the sun may look like in practice can be seen illustrated in the operation of the Red Square Nebula that can serve as a model for this purpose. In this model, we see all the essential features of the primer field system clearly visible. We see the two complementary bowl-type structures in operation. One concentrates the galactic plasma streams like a funnel. In the funnel, we can see the flip ring, and below it the choke ring, below which a cone of concentrated plasma extends that focuses onto a sun, or a number of them. And we see the reverse happening for the outgoing plasma stream. We can see all the essential features reflected here that have been observed in a laboratory plasma flow experiment. Our galaxy, when it is observed as a whole, also operates on essentially the same dynamic platform, though on a vastly larger scale than a solar system. But here too, we see unmistakable evidence of two complementary electromagnetic bowls that form highly condensed plasma concentrations under their respective confinement domes. The concentration is visible in X-ray and gamma-ray emissions. We can also see the extremely concentrated plasma sphere below the confinement domes and between the two bowl structures that are indicated by the existence of the confinement domes. The concentrated plasma sphere is also the center of the galaxy. Large intergalactic plasma streams feed into and out of the primer fields that form the confinement domes. These two long intergalactic connecting streams, one incoming and one outgoing, both have very long resonance cycles. These very long electric resonance cycles that correspond to the long distances between the galaxies evidently affect the strength of the primer fields that power the galaxy and are thereby the cause for the two long climate cycles that have been observed on Earth. These very long electric cycles, the 62 million year cycle and the 140 million year cycle, show up as long climate cycles that have been preserved in sediment records that enable us to look back in time more than 500 million years. Presently, the two very long climate cycles are both near their minimum point, whereby the weak plasma conditions have been created that have gripped the Earth for the last 2 million years, in which the ice ages happened. During these weak conditions that have been slowly developing for the last 5 million years, which are getting still weaker, the breakdown of the primer fields that power our solar system has become a regular occurrence during the weakest times. Then, when the plasma streams that flow through the solar system become so weak that they drop below a threshold, a point is reached when the pinch effect in the plasma streams is no longer strong enough to twist the plasma currents into knots to create the bolt-type magnetic structures with the void at the center that make up the primer fields. And so the primer fields do not form. What once existed suddenly exists no more. The plasma currents become no longer concentrated then, but simply flow through the solar system without becoming focused around the sun. At this point the sun simply turns off. It becomes inactive, dim, and cold. An ice age begins. The ice ages didn't last as long in the earlier phase of the weakening conditions. They lasted only 41,000 years then. As the general weakening continued, the 100,000 years long ice ages began. This became named the Pleistocene epoch. Throughout the ice ages in which the primer fields fail, the sun becomes inactive for long periods. It becomes a dim yellow star that glows mostly by its stored-up energy and whatever nuclear decay may be ongoing within it. However, evidence exists that the sun remains not totally shut down during the long ice age glaciation periods, which typically last 100,000 years. The Earth would turn into a snowball if the sun would remain inactive for 100,000 years. Fortunately, this doesn't happen. Periodically short pulses of high-density conditions do occur during the ice ages, which reinvigorate the plasma streams that enable the primer fields to form anew, whereby the sun becomes powered again. Unfortunately, these pulses are short in duration. The sun remains powered by these pulses for only a few decades, and then turns off again. Evidence exists that these pulses occurred on a fairly regular basis. Their occurrence has created large climate oscillations. Evidence has been detected in ice core samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheets that these short periods, when the sun becomes active again, have occurred in intervals of 1470 years. The resulting oscillations have been named the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations. During the extremely weak conditions in the galaxy that enable the ice ages on Earth, the sun remains constantly active only during the time frame of the interglacial pulses. In this time frame, the solar system is in its high power mode. During the long glacial periods between these pulses, the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations, in which the sun turns on and off, rule the scene and determine the climate. That's when we see the large fluctuations happening that prevent the Earth from freezing up completely. Researchers have identified 25 major Dansgaard-Oeschger pulses, spaced 1470 years on average. Since these pulses become significant during the low-power environments, they can serve as points of reference for determining the next potential cutoff point for the primer fields and within the powered sun. We can make a reasonable determination by looking at the last three of the Dansgaard-Oeschger events that occurred at the end of the most recent ice age. We see evidence of three such events there, spaced 1470 years apart. The first started with a major upswing, followed by a downslope. The second event started on the downslope, but was of short duration. The last upswing was much larger again, and it didn't collapse this time. If we're on the clock forward from these 3 steps, in steps of 1470 years, then the most recent Dansgaard-Oeschger event should have occurred roughly 200 to 300 years ago. This happens to be the point in time where we see the Little Ice Age ending. With this coincidence, a high probability exists that the warming of the world that broke us out of the Little Ice Age may have been a Dansgaard-Oeschger event. If this is so, a Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse may have saved civilization and humanity with it by preventing the collapse of the climate from the Little Ice Age into the Big One. The previous Dansgaard-Oeschger event, which occurred 1470 years earlier, takes us back to 1670 years before the present. This earlier pulse had ended steeply. If the current Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse ends in the same manner as the previous one, humanity will be in deep trouble, because nothing has been prepared for the kind of world we will then have to live in. Unfortunately, we like to play fantasy games, such as the global warming game, instead of being concerned with what is really going on. This means that all the global warming hoopla that was started in the 1970s was essentially a fairy tale spun around an astrophysical Dansgaard-Oeschger event that was in progress at the time and was beginning to peak in the 1970s. Let's hope that the currently weakening electric environment will remain sufficiently strong a bit longer so that it will hold back the cutoff point for the sun by at least a few more decades. These few extra decades would give us time to prepare the world for the demand cold glacial environment that awaits us beyond the cutoff point of the powered sun. The sunspot cycles are definitely getting weaker. By the current trend, the 25th cycle may not have any sunspots at all. The drop-off that we see happening here may be the ending of the current Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse that had its beginning during the Little Ice Age. It then peaked in the 1950s through to the 1990s. The great danger of our time is that when the current Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse ends, there is nothing much left of the interglacial pulse, either, so that a free-fall collapse may occur. The large rewarming events during the previous ice age that were caused by the Dansgaard-Oeschger pulses were historically of short duration. How close we are to the current Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse ending, which appears to be driving the current climate, cannot be determined. The remaining time will likely be in the range of decades, seeing that the sun is already on a weakening trend. The Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations are just one type of example in which rapid on-off conditions are natural occurrences for electric plasma phenomena. The so-called UFO phenomenon is another example of the same type. Many cases of UFO sightings have been reported. Many have been photographed. But note, what has been photographed conforms perfectly to the shape of the electromagnetic ball-type structure that forms the primer fields that in turn form a sphere of concentrated plasma at their focal point. This happens also to be the typical shape that has been captured in UFO photographs. We see the ball-type electromagnetic structure and the plasma sphere at the focal point of it. Both are clearly evident in this photograph. Reports say that the UFOs suddenly appear, that they can stand still, and that they can move quickly. They are seen existing in space, and are even hovering above the moon. They can accelerate immensely fast in their movement, and make extremely sharp sudden turns. They can do all this because the so-called UFOs are not spaceships, but are electromagnetic phenomena that have no mass, which would impede such movements. They are merely shapes created by electromagnetic interaction of plasma flowing in the atmosphere, which can become visible in the atmosphere. Some are seen as moving points of light, even pulsating light, some appearing in groups. By being electric plasma concentrations, the UFO phenomena also reflect radio waves, whereby they are seen on radar. However, when aircraft are launched to intercept them, the electric field around the aircraft affects the field, that forms the UFO, which thereby changes its position, or causes it to simply vanish. All this makes interception quite impossible. Of course, interception is also impossible for reasons that no UFO craft do actually exist. Extraterrestrial visitors traveling in physical spacecraft to our planet would have to fly against all the known laws of the physical universe and time. It would take a spacecraft 12,000 years to reach the Earth from our closest star, flying at a speed of 360,000 km per hour, which is roughly 30 times the speed of the Apollo 11 flight to the Moon, which might be the limit for spacecraft velocities, against the plasma background in space. Exotic theories have been invented in attempts to sidestep the physical limits and barriers in order to support the UFO theory, while the obvious reality is being ignored. In real terms, the UFO phenomenon stands as a simple example of electromagnetic structures that form in space with gigantic effects, and in the atmosphere with minute effects, by the primer fields being created in electric plasma streams. The UFOs thus become comparable to the sprites that appear in the upper atmosphere. The resulting effects, of course, depend on the coincidence of conditions that enable them, which are inherently rare and fragile in nature, and are specific for the type of atmosphere in which they occur. When the conditions occur in the lower atmosphere, they often enable a number of small plasma events simultaneously, which then become seen as multiple UFO sightings. This fragility of the sprites and UFO events evidently also applies to the complex structures and magnetic fields that create the conditions for our sun to be electrically powered, and for these conditions to form and to vanish. Both the UFO phenomenon and the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations illustrate to some degree how fragile the conditions inherently are that affect the powered state of our sun. The powered state of our sun has actually become a rather rare occurrence during last 2 million years of the Great Ice Ages. A few long periods with a constantly active sun, called the interglacial periods, have interrupted the normal, dark and cold world of the long ice ages that few people came through alive, where the climate conditions are fragile, depending on the Dansgaard-Oeschger events, to occur every 1500 years. This fragile nature that applies to our solar system applies to the UFO phenomenon too. It is not coincidental, therefore, that the UFO sightings became more frequent from the 1950s on through to the 1990s, when the current Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse peaked, whereby the solar activity became the strongest in recent time, in which the electric conditions on Earth were likewise the strongest. With the electric environment around our sun now getting rapidly weaker again, as the Ulysses satellite reported, we have entered a transition zone of extremely fragile conditions. The resulting critical warning that science affords us on this basis, unfortunately, is not precise to the day, but it is the best that scientific correlation of the numerous elements in the astrophysical arena can provide. The exact day for the sun reverting to its unpowered state, which will disable our agriculture, cannot be determined. The evidence before us presents nevertheless a strong case for us all to make extreme efforts towards building the vast new infrastructures that our continued existence on this planet will most certainly depend on. It is tempting to assume that only the far northern countries and regions, like Canada, Europe, Russia, and China, are affected by the coming ice age transition in which the sun becomes inactive. This is a foolish assumption. When the sun turns dim and the food supply is collapsing, the entire world is affected. Thus it becomes the task of humanity as a whole to build the infrastructures to protect human existence on this planet. Not to act decisively on this front amounts to committing universal suicide. The changing astrophysical environment that affects our world will affect everything. It affects even the magnitude of earthquakes. It is highly likely on this front too that we haven't seen anything yet in terms of consequences, which of course we can avoid by placing our civilization afloat onto the sea. Evidence exists that the sun will likely shed a major portion of its mass when its inactive state begins. it might eject as much as 30% of its mass. A sun absorbs large amounts of mass in the form of plasma during its actively powered state. The accumulation of plasma, which carries an electric charge, creates an internal electric pressure in the sun. This internal pressure becomes released when the external high-pressure plasma environment around the sun vanishes. Some evidence that this gigantic mass ejection happens is found in the orbits of the planets. At the present time, the planet's orbit had mere 71% of the velocity that a stable orbit requires. This means that the sun's gravitational attraction is presently 29% stronger than the centrifugal force of the planets in orbit. The large difference is evidently compensated for by the electromagnetic effects of the primer fields that maintain the orbits against the stronger gravity. In a lab experiment, non-magnetic steel balls were laid on a sheet of glass. They were drawn into a specific orbit around the center of two bowl-shaped magnets. The steel balls seen here are magnetically self-spacing. If they are disturbed and let go, they return to their magnetically determined positions. The experiment illustrates to some degree how the orbits of the planets are assisted magnetically. But during the long off times during the ice ages, when the primer fields no longer exist, or exist only during the short periods of the Dansgaard-Oeschger warming events, the sun's gravity would then have to be much weaker than it is today for the orbits to remain intact. Without the weaker solar gravity, the orbits would collapse over time. The fact that the collapse of the orbits did not happen during the ice ages indicates that the sun's gravity was lower during its inactive time, in which gravity alone determines the orbits of the planets, balanced against the centrifugal force generated by their orbital velocity. In order for stable orbits to be possible without magnetic existence, the sun must have shed a large part of its mass, and its gravitational attraction with it may be up to 25%. This means that we will see enormously large mass ejections happening when the primer fields collapse that maintain presently a strong plasma pressure around the sun, and thereby within the sun. The plasma mass ejection will likely be strong at first when the external plasma pressure no longer exists. The sun will then lose, probably quite rapidly, a large portion of the mass it has absorbed during the 12,000 years of its high-power conditions in the interglacial period. After the initial burst, the mass ejection will likely diminish exponentially over a span of several thousand years. During the early phase of the mass ejection, a large portion of the inner solar system will likely become enveloped within a cloud of plasma that will surely also affect the Earth, where it becomes absorbed in the crust and causes large electric stress fracturing, or electric explosions, that trigger earthquakes, and also cause large earthquakes themselves. The result will likely be the kind of phenomenon that in the fusion sun theory is referred to as the red giant stage of the sun, that is deemed to result from perceived hydrogen depletion, which is said to enable the assumed helium fusion phase. In real terms, the red giant stage is merely a plasma mass ejection event that results when the input power streams diminish below the threshold level where the primer fields collapse. Some of the mass ejection events accumulate the ejected solar mass in large plasma fields that are termed planetary nebula. The more powerful mass ejection events may reap a portion of a sun apart in extremely large electric stress explosions. These events are termed supernova events. In the fusion sun theory, they are deemed to be star explosions. In the real universe, they are nothing more than just mass ejection events. For us, when the sun's great mass ejection event begins in possibly 30 to 50 years from now, it won't be hugely cataclysmic in nature, no matter how large the event may appear from a distance, but it will result in major earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that we need to be prepared for. The Earth's magnetic field won't protect us then either, because it too will likely have collapsed by then, with the collapse of the primer fields. The only real cataclysmic event that happens typically among aging stars occurs when their accumulated mass becomes so great, especially during strong active periods, that the accumulation results in internal electric stress fracturing that breaks a sun up into two or more fragments that then form a binary, triple, and quadruple star system. According to a survey, singular star systems, like our own, are actually a minority among stars. With our Sun being a mediocre star, however, it is extremely unlikely that any type of electric stress fracturing will occur in our Sun, including during the coming Ice Age transition. Nevertheless, we will see extremely large electric stress fracturing events occur on Earth, in the form of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, especially along the San Andreas Fault, that is extremely stressed already. We would want to be far away from this area and be safely afloat on the oceans by then. The Sun is presently charged with plasma, like a car tire is pumped up with air. When a car tire blows, its air bursts out. When the equivalent happens to the Sun, great showers of plasma will burst from it and hit the Earth and cause those electric stress explosions that trigger earthquakes at unprecedented magnitudes that we must prepare for before they happen. We have no historic records available of how large these events were that will happen again. The last transition to an ice age occurred 120,000 years ago, that only few may have survived. Our modern infrastructures and cities may not fare well. They may not be able to withstand the seismic forces that might be unleashed. We really don't know what this means, except that we should prepare for the worst. The changing astrophysical environment that causes our Sun to become inactive may cause enormous seismic events as we have never seen before in all the millennia of what we call civilization. The building of floating cities and industries may prove to be the only safe path for humanity to survive the critical times ahead. It won't be easy, of course, to let go what we have built up over long periods, but this is what we may have to choose in order to protect our existence. However, on the wider horizon, the dark cloud that severely challenges our willingness to adapt ourselves to the changing environment before us comes with a silver lining. Or maybe even a golden lining. That is more valuable than anything that we have built and may have to let go. Our development into a highly advanced and capable species with creative and productive powers that no other form of life can equal may have been made possible by one of the special conditions that exist on the Earth only during Ice Age environments. The development of the human species didn't happen until the Ice Age epoch began. The critical factor here is the increased galactic cosmic radiation that results when the shielding effect of the heliosphere becomes disabled as the primer fields collapse. Without the primer fields, the solar heliosphere cannot exist, which is a sphere of plasma created by the solar winds that flow from the high-powered electric sun at the center. Without the heliospheric plasma shell surrounding our solar system, the full cosmic radiation flux then impacts the Earth. The increased cosmic ray flux appears to aid neurological development and lesser biological functions, including plant biology. The universe thus has given us a great gift with the two distinct environments that together aid our development on all fronts. It has given us alternately an environment for spiritual nourishment with high cosmic ray flux, and another environment with a brilliant sun for easy living. We appear to need both. It may be for this reason that the dawn of humanity did not begin until the required conditions were met. Those conditions didn't exist until the Ice Ages began. Cosmic rays are not rays in the standard sense, like rays of light, but are high-energy electrons and protons in motion at upwards to the speed of light. With the cosmic ray particles being electrically charged, they typically pass right through our body without damaging anything. However, as they pass through us, they generate electric currents within our biological systems that appear to be beneficial for the high-level functioning of our body. They tend to facilitate critical functions, like the air we breathe, according to intelligently arranged principles. Our biological and neurological systems are extremely complex electric systems that evidently benefit from increased electric activity over long periods of time. Our cognitive, scientific, and what may be called spiritual powers appear to be derived from this high-level nourishment, which in turn may have enabled and aided our continuing self-development as a high-level species. The interaction between cosmic ray flux and human development is surprisingly evident already in the weak cosmic ray environment of the interglacial period. The great developments in civilization have all begun during cold periods, when the cosmic ray flux is denser than normal. In the cold periods, the heliosphere tends to be weaker, which results from the weakening of the solar winds, which NASA's Ulysses satellite has given us an example of. For the same reason was the period of the Maunder minimum in solar activity, where no sunspots have occurred, which is coincident with the Little Ice Age, a period in which enormous scientific and cultural development occurred. This period of high cosmic ray flux gave us the greatest peace treaty of all times, the Treaty of Westphalia, that still stands as the foundation for civilization. This period also gave us great musical geniuses and scientific geniuses. The occasions when the primer fields for the sun collapse, so that the sun turns off, are evidently rare in geologic history. The general condition in the galaxy in which a sun can become inactive has not existed for over 400 million years prior to the current Ice Age epoch. The condition may have existed only twice before in Paleozoic history, once some 450 million years ago, and once more than 700 million years ago when the entire Earth froze up into a giant snowball, and remained frozen for more than 10 million years until the sun became reactivated again. The snowball theory, of course, is controversial. It seems too unlikely. However, in the context of the primer field's dynamics, the snowball event is totally plausible. It would have been nothing more than the natural occurrence of a weak electric plasma environment within a weak period for the galaxy as a whole. More significant for life on Earth is the massive ice age 450 million years ago, when the extensive proliferation of life on our planet began. The only other ice epoch of equal significance, where the condition exists for the sun to turn off, is the modern Ice Age epoch, the Pleistocene epoch, that coincides with the dawn of man. The coincidence of the dawn of man with the Pleistocene epoch is significant, as it indicates that our very existence as a highly developed species may have been the result of the high cosmic ray flux density that occurs in times when the sun is deactivated. In this sense, we are the children of an extremely rare occurrence, an ice epoch that is rich with great cosmic ray showers. Since this rich condition for human development gets interrupted during the interglacial periods, the enriching conditions did not exist during the entire span of the development of what we call civilization, which has occurred exclusively during the last interglacial period. This means that we really don't know, in terms of available evidence, what normal living is like, even as we are about to become drawn into it again. During the lean period of the interglacial, we have seen only occasionally some marginal increases in cosmic ray flux. History tells us that these occasions produced amazing effects. Great cultural breakthroughs were made in these times. The development of written languages, for example, occurred in one of these times. History also tells us that the great developments that did occur in these electric clearage time were typically cognitive and scientific in nature, which makes them forms of spiritual development that is the pinnacle of the mental realm. In a very real and powerful way, the rise and fall of civilization follows the ebb and flow of the recognition of spiritual values in society. The rise and fall of spiritual recognition in turn reflects the historic rise and fall of the galactic cosmic ray flux reaching the Earth, which is typically the inverse trend of solar activity. While we have no control over these trends, we should hold on to the developments that the trends, during rich periods, have provided. Spiritual recognition appears to be the pinnacle of our cognitive functions, such as reason, love, care, generosity, creativity, productivity, and so forth, in which we see our humanity defined, and with it our civilization. The Spanish painter Francisco Goya illustrated the connection in his etching. The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, of the Capriccio series of 1798. All this means that the pinnacle of our humanity, our cognitive and spiritual capability, is most affected by the changing cosmic ray flux. For example, the cultural developments that led up to the founding of the USA were all wrought in the time frame of high cosmic ray flux that is coincident with the weak sun of the Little Ice Age. Benjamin Franklin grew up in this high-intensity time frame. His discoveries were carried forward by society. His leadership inspired America's Declaration of Independence. This occurred even while the cosmic ray flux was already diminishing again. This thrust came from the developments in earlier time that was carried forward on the wings of great leadership. The coincidence between cosmic ray flux and the unfolding spiritual sense of humanity is also strongly reflected in the history of America's most spiritual and scientific religion, named Christian Science. Its development began during the Dalton Minimum. The discoverer and founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, was born in 1821 and grew up in a period of high cosmic ray flux. Her breakthrough discovery occurred much later, in 1866, on the wings of her own scientific self-leadership. But with the cosmic ray flux being relatively low at this time, her discovered Christian Science didn't gain wide public acceptance until after 1875, when the conditions improved. The period in which Christian Science took off and spread to many parts of the world coincides with a period of relative high cosmic ray flux density. However, when the high flux rate began to diminish, the advance faltered and began to reverse. Available statistics indicate that the Christian Science movement collapsed from 1970 onward, which coincides with the highest rate of solar intensity. That gives us consequently the lowest cosmic ray flux. The Christian Science movement collapsed from then on to the mere 7% that remains today. The same steep collapse also occurred in civilization generally during this critical period of low cosmic ray flux. The general collapse is reflected in high rates of spiritual insanity. This period, that spans slightly more than half a century, coincides with the most tragic revival of the system of empire the world may have ever seen, which forged the revival of fascism, terror, economic destruction, and the grand looting of society that is now culminating in mass genocide. The modern period of tragedy might be referred to someday as the pre-Ice Age period of insanity. It is here in this period where we find the dawn of the Cold War nuclear terrorism that has not yet ended, and the devolution of science that enabled the global warming terrorism to emerge for genocidal purposes. This is the current period that was marked by the banner being raised that declares that the Earth has cancer and that this cancer is man. Under this banner, the day industrial evil was unleashed, in which ever more industries were dynamited and imports were brought into the West from slave wage countries, which made up for the loss of production at home. On this path, huge profits were stolen from society. This was the time when clever tricks for massive profiteering by deception began to reign, primarily in the financial markets, where no wealth for society is actually produced. This period also became the period of the rise of the depopulation ideology that blocked economic development on all fronts and gave rise to AIDS and, as of late, the mass burning of food and automobiles in a starving world. While the coincidence of the rise and fall in civilization with the rise and fall of cosmic ray density does not prove a causative connection of the two trends with empirical certainty, the trends are nevertheless interesting, because their coincidence suggests that we may experience a dramatically enriched spiritual and scientific environment in the coming Ice Age, when the cosmic ray flux is expected to dramatically increase once the Ice Age transition unfolds, which to some degree has already begun. This does not mean, however, that the state of our civilization and of human development as a whole is totally dependent on the conditions created by the changing cosmic ray flux. History has shown that humanity has the power, as human beings, to raise itself above the floor conditions that the cosmic ray flux sets up as a kind of default state. When society doesn't exercise the power of its humanity, it rides the default train, with all the consequences the changing terrain brings with it. However, when humanity empowers itself, which has been demonstrated on many occasions, it can achieve miracles that are completely uncharacteristic for the times. We will have to develop this process of self-empowerment as a precondition to meeting the Ice Age challenge. Before us, this challenge cannot be met with the current convention of riding the default train. Let me present an example of what self-empowerment can accomplish when it is built on the highest achievements of the past as a starting point. The issue of slavery in the USA is a perfect example. The issue of slavery was understood as a part of a greater issue, the issue of human freedom versus empire. Abraham Lincoln understood this, while society at large did not. Society was riding the default train. Slavery should have been stopped in the 1830s, before Andrew Jackson developed it into a national tragedy. But it wasn't stopped. It festered and became a civil war that threatened the survival of the nation. And even at this stage, slavery wasn't stopped by an act of Congress. This type of breakthrough isn't made on the default train. Slavery was abolished by an executive order of a highly educated, self-qualified leader. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order of the President to the armed forces under his control. It became universally applied subsequently. If the President had waited for the default train to get to this point, the nation would have been lost long before this would have happened. What President Lincoln has achieved was totally uncharacteristic for the time. This type of leadership is required again, and again it appears totally uncharacteristic for our time. The struggle for freedom versus empire must still be fully won. But are there any qualified leaders standing in the hustings? This ancient struggle must be won before we can even begin to consider the Ice Age challenge. If the needed kind of leadership doesn't exist yet, it needs to be developed, and fast. We can't afford to wait for the default train to get us to where we need to be to master the Ice Age challenge. Society is presently dying on the default train. Its currency is being destroyed, which is no longer protected. It is being destroyed with excessive looting. It was once protected with the Glass-Steagall law that a great self-developed leader had enabled in the USA that had blocked the looting of the currency. The masters of empire spent $350 million in bribery to bribe Congress to repeal the law. And so it was repealed. On the default train, the robbers rule and society stands unprotected and dies by default for the lack of its self-leadership. There is a movement unfolding to restore the Glass-Steagall law, but the power for this isn't found on the default train. Thus the law won't likely be restored until society pulls itself out off the default train and redevelops its humanity and develops with it a higher-level self-leadership outside the domain that the robbers rule. At the present, society is so tragically rotting on the default train that it even tolerates to have its bank deposits stolen to pay off the bank's gambling losses. This happened in Cyprus in 2013, which was instigated to become the template for the world. The process is called bail-in. The laws that legalize the bail-in thievery to save the gamblers have already been passed in Europe, Canada, the USA, and in Australia and New Zealand. Unless you buy insurance, or such insurance exists for your bank deposits, and is viable, your assets are fair game to be seized. In the face of this exposure, society lays itself down and lets it all be, instead of developing its power to get off the default train and assure its self-protection. The Christian Science movement died on the default train. The pioneers who would raise the platform of science within the framework that Mary Baker Eddy had established were shunned or excommunicated. The same fate awaited, and still awaits, the pioneers of advanced science on many fronts, especially in the critical astrophysical and physical sciences, where the face of science is controlled, dominated, and abused for political ends, and made subject to approval. The same fate is also experienced in the religions, or even more so there. Everything rides on the default train there. The outstanding leaders were few, and far between, who raised the value of the human being and humanity far above the default concepts of God and man, far above doctrines, creeds, conventions, and traditions. The high-level leadership here would be one that stands on universal spiritual grounds, because the highest level in cognitive development is the spiritual level where we find love, truth, integrity, honor, generosity, humanity, and so on. If we develop a concept of God that includes all the concepts, without which a high-level civilization cannot function, so that civilization would collapse if a single one was missing. Then the spectrum that defines the composite of God would include love, truth, spirit, mind, soul, life, and principle. The divine love would then be reflected in love individually, truth be reflected in truthfulness, mind be reflected in wisdom and discovery, soul in beauty, poetry, and song, life in the abundance of human living, and principle be reflected in powers of expression, production, and creation, and so on. This composite of the qualities that define the term God was developed in the late 1800s in the USA by Mary Baker Eddy. What she presented after decades of self-directed and God-directed scientific development was so far above the background of her time that it took quite a few years for society to accept it and to move with it. She was a leader who stood far above the default train. Her development occurred against the background of the prayers of many to end slavery in the land. There was a movement afoot away from the default train. She evidently stepped further towards what no one had accomplished before. Her breakthrough discovery may be seen as God's answer to a nation searching for freedom. What came out of it may also have been just a stepping stone towards meeting the greater challenge that now lays before us to adapt our world to the dark and cold environment of an inactive sun. None of the qualities that Mary Baker Eddy laid onto the table as the composite of the highest concept of God were developed on the default train. High-level spiritual concepts are foreign there. Nevertheless, they all need to become common hallmarks of expression that define the society of human beings, because the task before us to maintain a civilization in a world under an inactive sun is extremely demanding. It is a task that requires the greatest qualities to be expressed on the near-universal platform. Where in the past great leadership pointed the way, the future demands require that this quality is developed universally, or nearly so, when seen in the long sweep of universal history. The advent of Christ Jesus, and later of Christian Science, may be seen as critical steps for advancing the world towards the necessary spiritual qualities for meeting the Ice Age challenge before us. This isn't accomplished on the easy chair or on the default train. The easy chair needs to be banned, and fast. Our modern society is still riding the default train. This is dangerous. By the lack of its self-directed spiritual development, society has rendered itself unqualified to make the grade required for survival. Technologically, the Ice Age challenge can be easily met, but the human footsteps to accept the challenge and fulfill the task are far from even being considered. We should become determined as never before to get ourselves out of the easy chair and off the default train into a race to meet the higher and fuller expressions of our humanity in all that we do. And we should do this decisively, as if our survival in the world depends on our succeeding. Because, evidently, it really does. With this in mind, it needs to be noted that we already see a faint turnaround happening towards greater expressions of the spiritual values in which our humanity comes more fully to light, and that this trend is unfolding. Weak as it may be, while the money god of empire still rules the default scene, which is the only scene where empire can rule. The turnaround away from the default scene, as small as this turnaround may presently be, leads towards scientific progress and an increased humanity with new spiritual paradigms that are slowly gaining notoriety, coupled with a sense of optimism in the air that the long epoch of empire is finally ending. Together with the empire policies of looting, war, fascism, monetarism, terrorism, and so on, our hope lies not so much in the fact that the cosmic ray flux is increasing again, and that in time it will become the gold trim of the silver lining of the dark cloud of the coming Ice Age, with its dimmer Sunday. Our hope lies in the power of our self-development that builds on the riches that we have already won for ourselves as human beings. Nevertheless, the coming new Ice Age isn't something to cry over, but is rather something that's worth celebrating. We celebrate the closing of what may someday be called a spiritual lean period, in which we achieved wonders nevertheless. Let us celebrate that when the heliosphere vanishes that is presently created by our electrically powered sun, a new age for humanity may dawn that will be brighter in the things that really matter than anything that we have seen thus far. When the next ice age begins, we can expect to see a radical increase of the profound humanist developments to occur that have shaped us for the last 2 million years, which now, from a flying start, promise to be of a magnitude and quality which we cannot imagine as yet, provided we survive the present world long enough to get there and build the infrastructures that we require to live in this new world that we will build for ourselves for the coming ice age environment. Getting there also means that we must end the long epoch of empire, that we shut down its deepening cesspools, the terror projects of empire, the nuclear war buildup, and the monetarism that empire has forged that is collapsing the world. Getting there further means that we scrap the depopulation ideology that is championed by empire, that is wrecking the economies, that we banish the system of empire altogether, especially its fascism, that demands the wholesale burning of food in a starving world. Yes, in a physical sense, a winter is coming that promises to be harsh, but this winter promises to be rich in blessings that promise a new age of exciting potentials and many more steps forward in the advance of civilization on all fronts, especially in science, spirituality, and Christian Science. Yes, the Ice Age transition before us comes with exciting potentials that stand before us as a powerful incentive for us to awake, to open our eyes, and to let go of the nightmarish dreams of empire and its shackles and chokeholds. The development of humanity appears to have always been intertwined with grasping the fire, both mentally and physically. On this road humanity wrought many great wonders throughout the long history of its self-development. Some of the wonders stand as giant structures that still puzzle us today. How were they built? What were they built for? In asking these questions, some of the ancient structures that we marvel at, ironically, also come to light to serve as a link to the future. They give us a hint of what the ancient builders may have seen in the sky, which can no longer be seen, because the modern age unfolds in an electrically collapsing solar environment that is trending towards its impending solar cutoff point. The builders of the pyramids may have experienced both of the solar extremes, a more brilliant sun than we have today, and the inactive sun that would have created the younger Dryas period of renewed glaciation, in which researchers suggest the Giza pyramids have been built. The suggested date seems to be confirmed by the complete absence of inscriptions inside the pyramids. Inscriptions became customary much later, during the time of the pharaohs. Numerous other features likewise place the Giza pyramids far outside the time frame of the pharaohs. One of these features is the quality of their design and the precision in construction. These place the Giza complex distinctly into a category of its own, that nothing which the Egyptians had produced and had been capable of at the time comes even close to. The suggested date seems to be confirmed by the complete absence of inscriptions inside the pyramids. Inscriptions became customary much later, during the time of the pharaohs. Numerous other features likewise place the Giza pyramids far outside the time frame of the pharaohs. One of these features is the quality of their design and the precision in construction. These place the Giza complex distinctly into a category of its own, that nothing which the Egyptians had produced and had been capable of at the time comes even close to. Assuming that the pyramids were built 12,800 years before the present, which is the most reasonable estimate to date, what would have been the motive for the people at the time to build the giant structures that they built? It appears that the motive may have been religious in a sense, while it was built around astrophysical phenomena. During the Great Warming period, 2,000 years previous to the building of the pyramids, a very large Dansgaard-Oeschger event broke the deep chill of the last ice age. At this time, when the sun became extremely active, the people may have seen with their naked eye the plasma images of the primer fields in action, centered on the sun. The type of image that we see today in the Red Square Nebula may have been seen, bright and clear in the ancient skies. The full image may have been seen in the time of a solar eclipse, while a part of the image may have been blazing in the night skies from dusk to dawn. The people may have seen in the sky two pyramid shapes of light, with the sun between them. On this basis the sun may have become an object of worship, the giver of abundant life resting on a pyramid. Then, suddenly, the sun becomes inactive again. The idea must have emerged at this time to build a pyramid for the sun, a house for the gods, provided on the earth when 1,000 years later the sun became brilliant once more, and soon thereafter went inactive again. A deep crisis may have erupted that inspired the building of the greatest pyramid of all times, to entice the sun god, to restore its shiny face for his people. The people may also have seen among the plasma images in the sky, perhaps right at the center of them, the famous 3 stars of the belt of the constellation Orion. These 3 stars appear to have determined the positions of the pyramids, their alignment to each other, and their relative size. When the Great Pyramid Building Project was launched, it appears that the ancients did not build not just one pyramid to inspire the gods, but have built all 3 pyramids together as a single project, with each pyramid being exactly aligned and proportioned in accord with the 3 stars of the belt of Orion. In this manner the pyramids of Giza stand for us as a silent testimony that the brilliance of the sun is not a permanent feature, but is a fleeting phenomenon at times, which once had inspired a monumental response by a nation to get the shiny face of the sun back. The pyramids also tell us another significant story. The evident fact that the Giza project was built 12,800 years ago is important, as it tells us that the region in which it was built was biologically sufficiently strong to support a large population. Giza is located near Cairo on the 30-degree latitude in the northern part of the Sahara. Petroglyphs indicate that the Sahara was a lush region before it became drowned in sand, perhaps by a swarm of comet fragments that became electrically fractured into sand while strafing the ionosphere, or even the atmosphere, in an event that no one lived to tell about. Since the Sahara was lush before this time, and supported a civilization during the times of the inactive sun, the northern boundary of the Sahara appears to be also the northern boundary of the Ice Age safe zone, coinciding with the 35-degree latitude. The safe line stretches across California, in the USA, north of Los Angeles, and from there through the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and in the east it cuts through the middle of China near Liaoning, and through Japan south of Tokyo. Anything north of that, typically along the 40-degree line, from Beijing to Madrid to Philadelphia, was permafrost country during the last ice age. This means that large portions of the Earth become difficult, if not impossible, to live in during the solar inactive times. This includes primarily Russia, China, Canada, the USA, and Europe, which share a common problem and thereby are natural partners for building the required solution. If the solution requires to place agriculture onto the sea, since land is scarce in the tropical areas, a perfect zone exists for doing this right along the equator. A narrow zone exists along the equator that is free of hurricanes. Placing agriculture onto floating modules made out of basalt and produced in nuclear-powered, automated industrial processes is probably more easily accomplished than greening the Sahara in laborious manual operations. The same is evidently also true for the automated production of complete housing modules as a necessary and free infrastructure to mobilize our humanity. Some protest here that this is too hard to do. If the people of a small culture, as far back as 12,800 years ago, were able to mobilize the economic resources to cut 4 million stone blocks out of the bedrock, weighing several tons each, transport them to the building site, and to place them with precision on a structure with a steep slope reaching 480 feet into the sky, in comparison with that, the building of bridges across the oceans with floating agriculture and floating pre-manufactured cities is small stuff. Considering the power of high-temperature automated industrial processes, motivated with nuclear power, A single 1 gigawatt plant should be able to produce 2,000 housing units an hour. We can have a whole new world coming online on this basis with comparatively little effort. No one needs to starve or perish when the sun becomes inactive. That's what the pyramids are telling us. This means that the future of Canada, Russia, and Europe is logically located on the sea along the equator, and to a lesser degree the future of China and the USA. It also means that we better get busy soon to transform our world. Another large construction project from ancient times tells us a similar story. The Stonehenge project, like the pyramid building project, reflects features that the ancient builders must have seen in the sky, as the features that were constructed replicate critical aspects of high-power plasma physics that were only recently discovered in laboratory experiments. The Stonehenge monument features a ring of 56 chalk pits, a meter wide and 3/4 of a meter deep, named the Aubrey holes in honor of the discoverer of them. Their purpose remains a puzzle unless one connects them with the sky. It was discovered in a lab experiment, published in 2003, that a solid beam of charged particles tends to form hollow cylinders that may then filament into individual currents. When observed from below, the pattern consists of circles, circular rings of bright spots, and intense electrical discharge streamers connecting the inner structure to the outer structure. The maximum number of the filaments has been found to be 56. Another experiment shows that the concentrated plasma that flows between the two complementary bowl structures of the primer fields forms a ring of 56 distinct plasma filaments, which in the real world, under extreme conditions, appear to have been visible in the sky. It has been noted that over long distances the filaments merge in groups of 2 or 3, as can be seen in this image of the supernova 1987A. The image shown here is giving us a cross-section view of a strong Birkeland current flowing in space. In another experiment, a more perfect cross-section image of a very high-power plasma stream has been recorded that shows the structure of the 56 plasma filaments self-aligned into a circle and streamers flowing into 2 other circles, and so on. It is surprising to note how closely the layout of the Stonehenge monument, built so long ago, matches the plasma flow patterns that became visible only recently in experiments produced in the laboratory. The surprising similarity that we find in these 2 cases suggests that the plasma flow patterns had been seen in the sky in ancient times, probably 7 or 8,000 years ago, in times when the interglacial sun was at its peak power level. The pattern that was seen then, which was replicated in the monument, would have been the outflow pattern of the concentrated plasma that was at the time visibly focused onto the sun. That we no longer see these types of patterns is the natural consequence of the weak plasma environment today. There is simply not enough density left remaining for any of the plasma features forged by the primer fields to be visible. Soon, the primer fields themselves will collapse, and the sun become inactive again for long intervals, as it had been during the previous Ice Age period. It may well be that humanity urgently requires the Ice Age challenge that now stands before us to awake the world from its current rut before the sleep of reason causes humanity to become extinct by the nuclear war that the world's leaders of empire have been building weapons for more than 50 years already. It would only take an hour and a half of thermonuclear war to create the conditions that causes the extinction of humanity and most forms of life with it. We need to raise the value of our humanity sufficiently high to take the steps required to cleanse the human landscape of the terror of nuclear war and everything that is linked to it. This is a spiritual task more than a political task. The correlation of cosmic ray flux with solar activity indicates that the advance of civilization is a spiritual task. This alone should inspire us to pursue spiritual development as the highest priority objective of modern time in order to become sufficiently spiritual-minded to protect ourselves. We wield weapons not out of strength, We wield weapons out of weakness. We wield them because of our inability to face one another as human beings. Let's hope that the Ice Age challenge will awake us enough to consider what human living is all about before we throw it away without ever having really lived. We face a choice, therefore. The choice is between the system of empire for which all wars are fought and the platform for freedom on which human culture and human development depends. So far, humanity stands impotent and tied to the ground. It stands latched to the system of empire, where it hails the weapon and throws away its humanity as if it was already dead, unable to choose life and to choose it more abundantly. In many respects, humanity still lives in the Roman age, reflecting the grand fascist arena of monetarism married to terror, inhumanity, and to population. Large segments of humanity are presently being killed under the new Roman banner and brutally starved, torn, and despised, while much of the world looks on silently, betting on the indexes for profits. While we no longer burn people alive by the dozen, as in the grand arenas long ago, we simply starve them to death at a rate of 300,000 a day by burning their food in automobiles in the form of biofuels. We need the Ice Age challenge as a new paradigm for living, in order that we may heal us of the tragedies that we have allowed to come upon us if we fail to become human above everything else, above politics, economics, religion, status, and sex, and fail to see ourselves as a single humanity honoring one another in love. We find ourselves unfit to meet the Ice Age challenge, which, technologically, is not a great challenge to meet. However, if we fail the Ice Age challenge, as we have failed in the past by not preventing the great wars, destruction, and looting carried out in the name of empires, then the coming Ice Age will bury us, with few exceptions. Perhaps then, in 1,000 generations, or 1,000,000 years, a new humanity will rise again, and will not fail those challenges that we presently have no intention to even address. The universe won't be cheated by us failing ourselves. Only we lose by our failing. But why should we fail? We only need to rekindle that flame in the heart that rekindles our humanity and our human productive and creative power and the beauty of our human soul and its scientific honesty. The world has become a desert landscape in all of these areas. We need to begin by turning the desert into an oasis across the world. The fading little flame of today needs to be nourished to become a great fire in civilization. Surely, we can do this. When we get to this point, not even the sky will be a limit for us, much less the conditions that we find on the earth. But will we do this? Will we dare to step up onto the wings and fly? Will we trust ourselves for the great task? These remain still open questions. Evidently, the greatest danger before us is not the astrophysical one. This one we can deal with fairly easily and protect ourselves from the astrophysical changes. The greatest danger that we face, then, is that we will do nothing, that we won't respond to the astrophysical challenge before us and die of starvation by not having created the infrastructures for our food supply that enables us to live richly in the dimmer world. The danger is that we keep up the present course, that we continue debating global warming and man-made climate change, and that we continue to bow to the monetarism of empire till the sun turns off and goes into its sleep mode. We have been brainwashed to commit ourselves to the present tragic course by the choruses of the professional scoundrels that the masters of empire have bought with their money bags to keep the dream of empire alive. Those who sing the empire song are people who have sold their soul for a song and have turned civilization into a desert of starvation already, before the big challenge even begins. That's what the global warming hoopla, the nuclear war terror, and depopulation are all about, standing against the future of humanity, aren't they? A similar type of brainwashing has also been applied to keep the fusion sun theory alive at all cost, as it serves the policies of empire well. It prevents economic development, energy development, and scientific development. Humanity is being kept tied into knots by debating the fusion sun theory, because the outcome of the brainwashing promises to facilitate the cherished objectives of empire, which is to eliminate 6 billion people from the face of the planet from the present 7 billion to about 1 billion. That's the officially stated policy for depopulation. Would you like to be depopulated? Would you like to see your children to become depopulated? This is what will happen if the Ice Age challenge is denied. If your answer is yes to the depopulation question, then sit back and do nothing, as you may do together with most of humanity, and you will have what you wish for. There is today little evidence on the horizon for a breakout from society's commitment to its small-minded thinking that has been imposed on it, such as in the context of the global warming scam and the fusion sun. The strain of the fusion sun continues on track, even while the evidence is monumental that the sun is an electrically powered star. However, behind the scene of denial of the evidence that we see, a denial that is political and artificial in nature, stands the humanity that we are, a highly intelligent species that will always remain what it fundamentally is, which tends to assert itself in times of deep crisis. The intelligence of humanity will make its claim, slowly, as this may unfold, and stand for truth, and will thereby prevent the greatest catastrophe of all times from occurring, which would result with certainty if the astrophysical processes that evidently loom before us would remain too long ignored and not be responded to. It is inherent in the design of humanity that the leading-edge thinkers will break through the fog of political games and open their eyes to the mountains of bodies of evidence that astrophysical processes have a powerful impact on Earth. It is inherent in the intelligence that we embody and reflect as humanity that the most alert scientists and truth-seekers do see the phase changes before they happen, by understanding the processes involved, and that they will inspire society to move with the requirements of the future that can be shaped with intelligent actions. Scientific progress remains the hallmark of humanity. Even if the options are at times obscured and the paths seem tied into knots, enormous scientific efforts have been made and continue to be made to push forward our understanding of the universe and its operation, and of ourselves in the unfolding process. The more we move forward with our exploration on this front, the more will a great renaissance take shape before us, with unlimited energy resources that give us access to unlimited building materials and food supplies, all with the kind of density that enables us to respond to the changing solar system, which then can no longer endanger our civilization, nor hinder its advances. In fact, these potentials stand before us right now, to be realized now, and be developed fully before the sun reverts to its inactive state, as it did during the previous ice ages. In the previous ice ages, the great potential that we have today to create a new world did not exist, but it does exist now. As an intelligent species, the most advanced that ever existed on the Earth, we will not squander this potential. Maybe this is what the universe recognized and put to our credit. Humanity had proven its worth before the Little Ice Age began. During the Little Ice Age, for the first time ever, a process was set in motion to create a society without empire on the distant shores of America. The Pilgrims' determination for the first time in history to raise the finger to empire eventually resulted in the founding of the USA, as the first sovereign nation-state on the planet, the city on a hill that the eyes of the world were indeed fixed upon. The remarkable achievement that had begun, which was a radical new development in civilization, for a people to collectively take a stand against the system of empire, would likely have been lost together with much of humanity if the Little Ice Age had progressed to become the Big Ice Age. But this train to near extinction was blocked with a major Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse that ended the Little Ice Age and extended the interglacial period by a few more hundred years from the late 1700s on. This extension was extremely critical for the development of civilization. It set the stage for the greatest economic and scientific development the world has ever seen, even though much was squandered away in recent years. The 200-year period of warm climates after the Little Ice Age, which was by its timing evidently a major Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse, gave us the population increase that is required as an economic base for carrying out the redevelopment of the world in preparation for the coming Ice Age period, when the sun goes on and off for typically 90,000 years. Was this ideal coincidence accidental? Was it a gift from heaven to save the world? Or was it turned by humanity? While the war against empire has not yet been won, the challenge of having to prepare the world for the environment of the dimming sun will bring back to light the great achievements of the past, and thereby swing the balance from empire, and its wars, and its money, to freedom, and to the fulfillment of the common aims of all mankind. The trend away from empire towards the freedom of humanity started in the 1620s, with the Pilgrims that settled in Massachusetts, who came there to set up a new world on the American shores, far from empire. The Peace of Westphalia that occurred later in 1648 to end the 30 Years' War also started a movement in the same direction in Europe, which still stands to some degree as the foundation for modern civilization. On this same type of path, as the power of society's self-directed spiritual development has stepped up far above the default train, the threat of nuclear war will vanish and become forgotten history, as though it never existed, together with all the ugly garments that empire still parades, its monetarism, terrorism, fascism, greed, slavery, genocide, poverty, hatred, lies, and so on and on. The requirement to meet the human need in the grandest style possible, and with the greatest freedoms unfolding from it, has been the basic dream and hope in every religion that ever was, which is a dream that has so far never been fully realized, but might be realized at last as we step forward in our self-directed progression from religion to the scientific realization of the grand humanity that is inherent in us all, in which we are one. The astrophysical challenge of the dimming sun puts a new type of challenge before us that inspires new paradigms, since the old paradigms no longer apply. This is something to celebrate. It inspires us to reclaim our humanity, raise it up anew, explore it in new novels, new poetry, and new songs, on the road of our intentional development of our unlimited potentials. This makes our future bright in spite of the dimming sun, or because of it, for the challenge it imposes. Harvest is seed time. Seeds, wind blown, carriers of a secret still unknown. Poems in the words of nature, sentinels of an intelligence yet unseen. Prophets of the enduring, apostles in an endless landscape. Discovering love. Seeds, wind blown, poems in the words of nature, sentinels of an intelligence yet unseen. The melody of nature, what a song! Whispers of a splendor grander than the heavens. Like seeds are we whisper too. Seeds bearing gifts for the world. Gifts wrapped up in sunshine. Gems are we, unfolding a majestic song. Blue Mountain. Whispers of a splendor grander than the heavens. Like seeds are we whisper too. Seeds bearing gifts for the world. Listen to the song. Listen to the heart. Listen to the silence where strands of love unfold. Listen to the symphony of our humanity. In this symphony we are one. One with the universe itself. Flight without limits. Listen to the song. Listen to the heart. Listen to the silence where strands of love unfold. Brighter than the sun. Listen to the symphony of our humanity. In this symphony we are one. One with the universe itself.